Where have you been for 2 days? Are you okay? Give us the call and let us know you're alive. Babe, are you in the house? Pick up. Hello? Babe. Babe, if you're in the house, please pick up.
911, what's the address of the emergency?
I need to file a missing persons report.
What place is this person on the system?
Sunrise, Florida.
What's her name?
Janine Catanzaro.
Okay, and when was she last seen?
Oh, I knew it was Thursday morning. I left for work at 7 a.m. She left sometime between 7:30 and 8, and I have not seen her since.
Message from the Sunrise Police Department. We are searching for a missing person in need of medical attention in your area. The person's name is Janine Catanzaro, a 50-year-old white female with brown hair and brown eyes, approximately 5 feet, 3 inches tall, weighing 100 pounds. She was last seen on Thursday, November 29th at 7 a.m.
When Traeger finally makes the decision to actually report Janine missing, days have gone by, and what raises a red flag is he spent those 4 days not looking for her, not staying at home, showing no concern. What we know from Janine's bank records is that he was out gambling, he was out partying, he was out spending her money, and not doing it with her permission. He's a person of interest, and he's just mocking the entire situation.
So I don't want to make you uncomfortable. We've been very comfortable meeting you, but I need to get to the matter at hand, okay? You last saw your wife when?
Thursday morning, 7 a.m.
What was she doing?
Getting ready to leave the house.
And what kind of conversation did you have that morning?
Just typical, like, have a good day, good luck with your new job. But I gotta go, I gotta get ready. I mean, it wasn't much of a conversation.
What strikes me about this is thinking about the context of the situation. His wife is missing, and one would think he's genuinely concerned about her well-being. There would be a sort of demeanor and more, almost impatience with, well, why are you asking me these trivial details? But you can see in his body language, it seems like he's preparing. He's trying to get the lay of the land, and he's trying to take in some information so he can spin a story that matches with what he knows the circumstances to be.
Dollars in debt.
He's minimizing the toxicity of what's going on, almost as if he's trying to take some sort of responsibility. Yes, I lived in my car because I had a problem and I had to take care of myself. Not that what he was doing was damaging to the relationship and there was actual arguments and violence going on there. And that's the reason why Janine kicked him out of the house. So he's still engaging in this pathological lying, controlling how police are seeing him, and really controlling the whole narrative here.
There was actually 2 incidents where the cops were called over the past.
One I was there.
Okay.
The other one I wasn't.
Right.
Whatever night it was. The point is, I voluntarily left for the night.
Okay.
Just so there wouldn't be any arguing, so there wouldn't be any misunderstandings, no nothing. The next day, she didn't even remember the incident. That's how drunk she was. Okay. So the second she starts drinking, she becomes, there's no better description of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde than you will ever see.
But there was another
Water under the bridge. But there's been no physical altercations between us whatsoever, ever.
He definitely writes his own narrative and then tries to force circumstances to match it, ignoring things that conflict. And I think this is where he uses his charm to kind of get people to go along with his narrative and his description of things. But he is so confident in his ability to write the narrative because he just thinks he can, through force of his personality, kind of get people to go along and be taken in by his story.
We've developed a nice relationship. I spoke with you for a few hours at your house. But I've got to ask you some matter-of-fact questions.
Ask me, please.
That's my job.
I understand that. And I'm not hiding anything.
You understand I'm here to help you find your wife.
I am not hiding anything.
I have to ask you why you didn't call the police at that time.
Literally, I'm not the cop calling. I just, that sounds stupid probably, but I expected that she'd be home. I really did. I expected everything would be fine. I knew she wasn't driving, so I figured she's with a friend, she's okay, everything's all right.
When we evaluate people professionally, sometimes we think of this as impression management. This is somebody who is trying to make sure they stay clear. But what we know is psychopathic individuals are extremely skilled at manipulating people, at creating false impressions of who they are. And Traeger definitely is a very skilled individual in the areas of manipulation.
I know that it's my fault that she's gone. And I already know this is what's going through her mind. There's no doubt in my mind.
When you say it's your fault, what do you
Well,
mean?
my fault, because I'm there, she can't. He's afraid to have that confrontation with her family. He up his life, you know, these 10 years have been nothing but going downhill. I've been the worst husband on the planet. She's told everybody in the world that I'm the worst husband on the planet, but she still loves me.
The story's morphing, it's getting bigger, it's getting more elaborate, it's getting more detailed. And what it's also getting is more focused on blaming Janine for her own absence. Traeger is going out of his way to give the authorities a level of detail about Janine that, first of all, is easily disproven, but casts no blame toward himself. This person is very selectively choosing when to give them details and when to hold back details. And that strategy is 100% Joseph Traeger trying to stay in charge of that interview.
I spoke with her. She said, you better watch what you say on the phone.
How would you describe their marriage?
Okay. They went to kindergarten together.
Okay.
Years later, they started talking, whatever. He was incarcerated, okay, for rape for his wife.
Okay.
Which he claimed he didn't do.
Okay.
She believed him. However, she believed him. Me, my ex-husband, my brother, we all talked to him. What are you, nuts? I said, are you crazy? Well, anyway, she married him, and then it was one thing after the other to get him a driver's license. Then he went and took $6,000 out of her bank book.
Okay.
How he did that, we don't know. The man is very smart, very clever.
Okay.
They call him a backstreet lawyer.
Okay.
That's how he's a manipulator. You know what I mean? Something's fishy.
Okay.
Something's fishy.
Okay, we're gonna get to the bottom of it.
For many of the psychopaths, it comes back to that charm. And it's that they have that ability to influence people despite external circumstances. And Janine's mom captures it. I mean, on paper, this is a guy that you do not want to have anything to do with. But he's so charming, so manipulative, that he has convinced her that none of this other things that, you know, you see and hear about me are true. And that's all the lead up to, so then they get married.
And they start to understand a little bit more about the depths of Traeger's manipulations, that he's not just reserving this tactic and strategy for the interviews with law enforcement. This is part of how he kept Janine engaged in their relationship. What it gives us is a very clear understanding that Joseph Traeger is parasitic. He lives off of Janine, and because she is his meal ticket, he does whatever he needs to and will stop at no length. There's no topic that is off limits for him to use as manipulation.
But do you think she allowed him back in the house?
I don't think so. I'm 99.9% positive. She didn't want him to have a key. She didn't want him in his life. She wanted in her life. She wanted him gone.
Years after, there was a lot of gambling. There was a lot of verbal abuse, a lot of, verbal stress. I didn't feel safe. My children weren't safe. There were incidences that happened between us that ended up in domestic violence charges against him. So at that time, I couldn't take anymore. And it was shortly after I had told him that he attacked me. When he made threats to me and he tried to take my life, he told me that you ruined my life. You're not leaving here alive. I'm going to kill you. Then I'm going to find your body. I'm going to wrap you up in trash bags and I'm going to dump you and they'll never find you.
What is eerily similar, but not surprising for us clinically, is that for the ex-wife describes a volatile relationship. This is an individual who doesn't deal well with rejection. He doesn't deal well with being told no, with limits being set on him, with not getting his way, and that need to maintain power and control, both in his relationships as well as in his environment, likely are the trigger points for him. They are likely the trigger and the powder keg that cause him to erupt into these extreme levels of violence that you don't see in the person who's in that interrogation room.
Situation, as most of his life experience tells him he's able to.
I failed on what questions?
You failed on the relevant questions.
Which were?
Did you hurt Janine?
No.
So, when it comes down to this is somewhat, I would say normal people, this would be somewhat out of character. I'm a fairly smart guy. I can put two and two together even though I haven't been. Fall asleep on me, Joe?
I'm just listening. Tired. I'm very tired.
When Traeger is not really paying attention and the detective has to point it out to him that like, hey, do you even care? What are you doing? Are you falling asleep on me? And that could be a sign of him just sort of shutting down at this point because I think he's being challenged, that he's being portrayed as like this evil, bad person. And his ego really can't handle that. He's trying to control himself not to get into this rage that he usually will get into when he is challenged.
Joe, you've been all over the place.
You could yell at me, and
I don't.
And I'm telling you, I had nothing to do with her disappearance.
Yeah, but
this turned out to be a fracture of the pinky toe. We had the medical report. Yet she sat there and told the jury that I hit her with a baseball bat and shattered her foot in 5 places.
What we see is the way that Janine's mother described him as a backstreet lawyer. We start to see that come out, that this many years later, almost 2 decades later, Traeger is still able to quote what he believes the medical report said about his first wife's injuries, that minimizing the seriousness of what happened in that crime, minimizing the facts that are known, including the medical injuries. And it's what he does. He blames the victim. When confronted with facts, he distracts, he evades, and he tries to take back control. And that's exactly what he's doing here.
Now, you had told me earlier when we were talking with polygraph film, like you had, we talked about Janine and previous incidents with Janine.
Previous incidents?
We talked, all right, yeah, we were out at the house. When we were out at the house, sometime in like beginning of November, right? For Janine, she had some medical issue going on.
I don't know.
Contusion on the head, maybe.
That wasn't because of me. I wasn't there. She got drunk. She fell down and cracked her head open in the front of the house.
All right, so it would be surprising to you that she told us that you did that?
Oh, no, that's absolutely ridiculous. And that is 100%
Total
Total
you said physically hurt. Are you emotionally hurt?
Well, unfortunately, because of my behavior, yeah. I mean, she's, accused me of emotionally draining her and,
It's interesting, every time Traeger's presented with evidence to the contrary of what he's explaining, he discounts it. And we see other accounts where he's acting as the sophisticated person. He's using proper medical language, proper legal language, but he can only do that for so long. And that's pretty typical of a psychopath. They can only really put on this false sense of self and false image of this grandiose sense of self for, just a little while. Once you go into details, they're gonna fall apart because really it's just this big, outwardly projected image, but there's nothing inside.
You can't be this. You can't be this naive to understand that we know she didn't leave the house. That she does not leave the house after 8 o'clock on the Wednesday morning. She doesn't. We know. See, again, we're back to the $1 million question, Joe. She went somewhere and you're the last person there. Everything stops when you leave. Everything stops. We have proof. It is absolutely sustainable proof. Proof evident that she does not leave the house after you arrive at 8 o'clock that morning.
you are never going to believe
No, you know you're in a bad spot. I want to help you get out of that spot because I think, Joe, there's a reasonable explanation for this. Joe, I'm not going to let you walk out the door today without giving you every opportunity to change the narrative. I thought you had a heart.
Listen,
Joe, it's simple, man. Change the narrative here. She didn't leave the house. She did not leave the house.
He's got to get rid of the body because the police would never believe him. And that's why he decided to get rid of the body. And he describes that he placed it in a couple of garbage bags. He moved the garbage bags into the garbage can while it was still in the garage. And then he immediately moved the can out to the curb so that it would be picked up. Even if we believe his story, he finds his wife dead, panics, makes this decision that he's got to cover it up. But then later that day, spend his time going to the casino gambling. Our initial reaction is, how could somebody do that? But the important thing to keep in mind is that psychopaths don't experience emotions like guilt and even fear the same way that we do. So it's almost an emotionless narrative.
Did you have anything to do with it?
Absolutely not. Listen, I've had the police here 3 different times, crime scene investigators. They went through the house. There's nothing, whatchamacallit, nothing for me to be suspect of. You know what I'm saying?
Oftentimes, narcissistic individuals have a difficult time not staying the center of attention. They have a hard time losing control of a narrative, and they enjoy being center stage, even if the attention is negative. Some attention is better than no attention at all. And while Traeger could have chosen not to give any statements to the media, and it's what most people would choose to do, he can't resist.
And we're all devastated over this.
What did she mean to you?
She meant the world to me. I've known my wife since we're 9 years old, 10 years old. We've known each other for 40 years. We had financial problems, so all marriages go through problems. Nothing major.
You're desperate to get her back home.
Absolutely.
What would it mean to you to get her back home?
It would mean the world to me to get her back. It would mean everything. you find her? Or has she been recovered?
We're gonna find her.
I hope so.
And what are we gonna find, Joe? What are we gonna find?
I found her. Listen to me. This is what's breaking my heart right now, okay?
Joe, it's breaking mine too.
At this point, we're starting to see some ounce of emotion, which we don't normally think of when we talk about psychopaths. We're seeing it's just his fear of getting caught, fear of what the next part of the narrative is going to be. The walls are closing in on him, and he's got to think of something new. It's not a genuine, connection to people like I miss you, I love you. It's all fear-based because something's gonna happen to him.
There's no way we can help the situation after she's found. And Joe, look at me.
I'm more worried when you find her. The narrative will show what happened.
What's it gonna show, Joe?
You tell me I'm not a man.
I just told her.
My assumption is it was a seizure. Well, I mean, that's all I could think of that would cause her to have fallen down and that's it. But I did not body slam her. I did not choke slam her. I did not do anything.
No one's going to believe that part of this. No, that is not believable that you came down and found her in the kitchen in full of blood.
Your time
Is running out.
is running out. This is the opportunity.
Still can't tell you what you want to hear. What are you going to do with me at that point?
You're walking out the door tonight.
So I'm going to take 24 hours to think about it. I got to come back tomorrow to my phone. Let me think about this. Let me think about what I want to say.
Well, let's go eat and you can think about it and then we'll come back. I'm hungry. Let's go get some
Let's
food.
go eat.
They did something very shrewd by switching gears and offering to take him to dinner so that they could keep him talking. And because he has this narcissistic belief that they couldn't possibly be lying to him and manipulating him the way he's been manipulating them, he believes them. He can't possibly envision that these detectives were shrewd enough to start the cat and mouse game with him, to start manipulating him so that he would begin talking. And that is precisely what we're watching happen. Is detectives have had a lifetime career of studying psychopathic individuals, and they're now using one of their own tricks against them.
Mikey, we're gonna talk.
Give me the chip for this.
It's fine. I'll take care of it. I'm not gonna run. Don't anyone. You tell me, so you have me. Good time. I will be ready. And
Is there anyone else you want to tell us? Anything else we need to
what 9 bodies that might as well get it all together, you know what I'm saying? So,
You guys about ready to go?
Yeah.
How much left?
keep it on. All right. But I think today, it's okay.
Off the record.
He starts to confess. He starts to tell them what he actually did to Janine. He throws a few jokes in there. He continues to act glib, laughing about the fact that there's 9 bodies total. And what we see is that, again, Joseph Traeger is 200% focused on himself. He even goes so far as to say, I'm planning to go to work tomorrow. You can see a frame of thinking where he truly doesn't see things the way the rest of us do.
Oh, come on! Are you serious?
I need to take you to the hospital.
Oh my God! Mike, that's so
Where's the car?
do that to me.
Where I think we really see what we think of as a narcissistic injury, a wound to his own ego, is how focused he is on figuring out how they pulled it over on him, how they were wearing a wire and he didn't see it, he didn't consider it, it never even occurred to him that they might lie to him. And what you can see is he's struggling to unpack that reality and understand how he missed the signs because he's smarter than everyone else. And that is how a narcissist thinks.
You didn't have to do me like this. Like, I'm straight up with you, you know what I'm saying? You didn't have to do me like this. You could have given me the week I was asking for.
I can't do that, Joe. You want to talk about it?
All right, well, like I stated earlier, starting on the night of the 27th, I had texted her saying that I needed to come to the house in the morning to get my Social Security card because I was going for a job interview, basically. There was nothing bad, nothing negative, nothing argumentative at that point. She had mentioned to me on a number of occasions previously, not on this day, but that, she was, thinking about divorce. I mean, I've said it to her a million times. I said, look, if you really want a divorce, I'm not going to fight you on the divorce. I mean, I love you. You're my friend. We've always been friends. I'm always going to be a part of your life.
You wanted to stay, right?
I wanted to stay. I mean, I'm living on the frickin' streets of nightmare. Anyway, I told her, let me stay. Let's talk about this. She's like, no, I got to get ready. And I'm like, well, but I got nowhere to go. So, I didn't want to go. I was like, well, let me stay. Let me go take a nap. Well, that's where it all went down. And, she's like, look, if you're not going to leave, I'm calling the cops. And I'm like, why would you call the cops? There's no reason to call the cops.
Traeger's wound in that moment is not just about rejection. It's about losing control. It's about his gravy train is coming to an end. So he really had come to the end of his options. And now she's telling him, I'm cutting you off. You are no longer welcome in my life, in my home. You no longer have access to my resources. And what does he do? Joseph Traeger doesn't handle being told no.
But anyway, she went for the phone. I went and I grabbed the phone. And in the process of grabbing the phone, we went down to the floor. She started screaming. And I'm like, no, why are you doing this? And again, it was, trying to keep it calm. Well, this is when I put a knife on the counter. And I panicked, and that's why I stabbed her. I mean, that's why I did it.
Where did you stab her?
Back of the head. Like the back of her, I don't know what you call this.
When the knife slid in, was it difficult to slide in?
I hate to say it, no. Well, it was very easy.
Did it just slid in?
Yeah, I was very weirded out, by the whole, I can't believe I just did that, and I can't believe how easy it was. I don't know if warm butter is the right, but, between warm butter and an apple. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of soft. Once I penetrated with the knife, at that moment, I mean, I just wanted her to stop. And believe me, she stopped. And it was instant.
Traeger's description of the murder is extremely horrendous, but it really highlights these traits of psychopathy like callousness. He talks about the knife going into his wife's head as being like warm butter. I mean, who describes something like that? He's almost like taking pride in what he's saying, and he's bolstering himself up like he's just this macho man, dominant in control, and he can do what he wants with, his victims being his wife.
I mean, if there's any, please don't take this the wrong way, but if there's any comfort here, it's knowing that she did not suffer. I mean, it gives me a little bit of comfort. I mean, I know you guys are looking at me like, look, you're a savage piece of right now.
And this all started because you didn't want her to call 911.
I know it sounds really pathetic, doesn't it? I mean,
A little ridiculous.
I understand that. And you listen, I'm not happy or proud of what I did. Believe me.
I don't think you are.
No, I'm not. I am sick over it. I haven't slept over this.
This is all his learned behavior. He's understood by living in the world that you're supposed to care if other people suffer. And so he's trying to kind of portray the detectives like, hey, look, I'm not a psychopath. I care that she didn't, that gives me some comfort, but it doesn't come across as genuine at all.
Traeger has
The night the wall still cut Berlin in half, a scream vanished into concrete, floodlights, and silence, and somewhere between East and West a name was erased from the city's memory, filed away as a cold case long before anyone dared to call it that. Because in those days nothing was ever just a crime, it was an incident, a disruption, a mistake that could not exist on paper, and yet the stain remained, seeping through decades, through sealed archives and guarded mouths, waiting for the moment when the past would decide it was done waiting. It began on a damp October evening in 1984, the air heavy with coal smoke and rain, the kind of night when footsteps echo too loudly and windows glow like watching eyes, when the border strip lay stripped bare under arc lamps and guard towers hummed with electricity, a dead zone engineered to swallow people whole. Her name, spoken only once on the police radio before being replaced by a case number, was Anya Richter, 23 years old, a tram conductor by day, a student by night, a daughter who promised she'd be home before midnight and never was. She was last seen near Invalidenstrasse, walking parallel to the wall, close enough to feel its cold breath, far enough to believe she was safe, and that assumption would cost her everything. By morning, her bag was found first, canvas soaked, strap torn, contents scattered as if emptied in a hurry, lipstick snapped in two, notebook missing, ID still inside, as if someone wanted her name known but not her words. There were scuff marks in the gravel, half obscured by rain, a smear of something dark along the concrete base of the wall, and a single shoe lying where no one would normally lose one, toe pointing east, heel pointing west like a cruel compass. Border guards claimed they saw nothing. Patrol logs were clean. The watchtower camera covering that sector was down for maintenance. A coincidence that would repeat itself often enough to stop sounding like one. Within hours, rumors raced faster than official statements. Some said she tried to cross. Others whispered she knew someone she shouldn't have, that she carried information, that she was being watched long before she disappeared. In a city trained to distrust every version of the truth, speculation became its own currency, traded quietly in kitchens and stairwells, while the authorities moved with the practiced efficiency of people who already knew where they wanted the story to end. A missing persons report was filed, then downgraded, then absorbed into a broader investigation that never seemed to advance. Questions were asked softly, answers given softly, and doors closed just as softly behind them. Weeks passed. The shoe was catalogued and shelved. The bag was returned to the family with an apology that sounded rehearsed. Anya's mother waited by the phone every night, the dial tone a thin wire stretched across her nerves, while her father stood in line at government offices where no one met his eyes. Friends were questioned once, twice, then advised to focus on their own futures. The neighborhood grew quiet around the subject, as if speaking her name too loudly might attract attention of the wrong kind. And somewhere in a gray building with no sign on the door, a thin file began to grow, page by page, detail by detail, until it reached the thickness that signaled not progress but abandonment. The official theory, never formally announced, drifted into place like dust. Accidental death, possibly linked to an attempted escape, body unrecovered, case inactive. It satisfied the need for closure without providing any. It also ignored the inconsistencies that nagged at the edges, the witnesses who claimed to hear shouting that night in a language they couldn't place, the truck seen idling where no truck was authorized to be, the border dog handler who requested a transfer 2 days later and got it without explanation. Each anomaly was noted, then neutralized, wrapped in bureaucratic language until it lost its shape. The wall stood. Life continued. The case went cold. Years slid by, measured in concrete slabs and propaganda posters, and then, abruptly, the world shifted. The wall fell. Files were opened. Names resurfaced. For a brief moment in the early 90s, it seemed like the past might finally be forced to answer for itself, and Anya Richter's file was pulled from the archive, its edges frayed, its contents smelling faintly of damp paper and old secrets. Investigators from a new Germany reread the reports with fresh eyes and found what had always been there. Gaps. Missing pages. Redactions where no redaction should be. A chain of custody that broke and reformed like a bad memory. Someone had curated this case, sculpted it carefully, and that realization changed everything. They found the notebook, or rather a reference to it, listed in an evidence index with no corresponding item number. A ghost entry that suggested the most important piece had never made it to the shelf. They found a memo stamped confidential, dated 3 days after Anya disappeared, ordering a halt to all inquiries in the border sector for reasons of national security. They found a name mentioned once and never again, an officer attached to Border Intelligence whose service record ended abruptly in 1986 with a commendation and early retirement. Each discovery pulled at a thread, and the fabric of the old explanation began to tear. But reopening a case did not mean solving it. Witnesses had aged or vanished. Memories had softened into shapes that could no longer cut. And still, the sense persisted that the truth was close, locked behind something solid but brittle, waiting for the right pressure. That pressure came decades later, not from a detective, but from a clerk tasked with digitizing records no one thought dangerous anymore. In a mislabeled box marked infrastructure reports, she found a set of files that did not belong, surveillance transcripts that covered the border strip on the night Anya vanished, transcripts that contradicted the official logs line by line. Voices were identified, times matched, and in the margins, handwritten notes connected dots that had never been meant to meet. The files told a different story, one of an unauthorized operation, of an informant gone quiet, of a decision made in minutes that would echo for generations. They suggested Anya had not been a passerby but a target, not an accident but an erasure. The cold case was suddenly warm to the touch, dangerous even, as journalists caught wind and began asking why this particular disappearance had been buried so deep. The community that had once whispered now demanded answers, and the shock rippled outward, through families who remembered, through officials who hoped not to be remembered at all. When the name of a suspect finally emerged, it landed like a dropped glass in a silent room, a former officer long shielded by the system he served, a man who had lived an unremarkable life since reunification, collecting a pension, attending barbecues, never once publicly linked to the night that defined someone else's end. Hidden files exposed his movements, his orders, his proximity, and for the first time the case was declared closed, the words printed in bold as if typography could carry the weight of history. And yet, as the city absorbed the news, as headlines blared and commentators spoke of justice delayed but delivered, a quieter question lingered beneath the noise, one that refused to be filed away. If the truth had been hidden so easily once, if a life could be erased with a stamp and a signature, what else lay dormant in the archives, mislabeled, waiting? Anya Richter's name returned to the air of Berlin, heavier now, burdened with context, and the wall, long gone, seemed to cast a shadow again, reminding everyone that some cold cases are closed on paper while their echoes continue to walk the streets at night. The declaration that the cold case was closed did not quiet the city. It agitated it, like striking a bell that had been hanging mute for decades, and the vibration traveled through neighborhoods that had learned to survive by forgetting, because closure on paper did not align with the unease in the streets, with the way former neighbors suddenly avoided eye contact, with how certain names resurfaced only to be followed by abrupt silences. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, microphones raised, hungry for a clean ending. But Berlin had never been a city that offered clean endings, only layers, and beneath the official narrative another current began to move, slower, darker, pulling the story away from its neat conclusion. The man named in the files, Klaus Berger, 71 years old, former border intelligence officer, did not look like history's villain when cameras found him. He looked like a pensioner caught in the wrong light, gray hair combed carefully, hands folded, eyes steady in a way that unsettled more than rage ever could. He denied everything in a single sentence delivered through his lawyer, a sentence constructed like a wall of its own, smooth, solid, difficult to climb. He claimed the files were misinterpreted, that context had been lost, that the chaos of the era had produced many shadows mistaken later for intent. And for a moment, the city hesitated because doubt was a reflex it knew well. Investigators returned to the evidence with renewed urgency, aware now that every inconsistency would be dissected in public. The surveillance transcripts showed voices calling out coded phrases, a signal used only during covert detentions, never recorded in official manuals. A timestamp placed Berger's unit exactly where Anya Richter was last seen, contradicting his personnel log by 17 minutes, a small discrepancy with enormous implications. A vehicle ID matched the truck witnesses remembered idling near the wall, unauthorized, unmarked, invisible to anyone trained not to see. Each piece alone was suggestive. Together, they formed a pattern that refused to be accidental. But the pattern raised a question more dangerous than who did it. Anya's missing notebook returned to the center of the investigation, its absence louder than any testimony. Friends recalled her scribbling obsessively in the weeks before she vanished, notes about routes, schedules, names half crossed out. She had mentioned meeting someone who frightened her, someone who spoke as if he already knew her thoughts. One friend remembered a phrase Anya used almost jokingly at the time about walls having ears. That joke now sounded like a warning ignored. A breakthrough came not from the file but from the past, walking into a police station one gray afternoon. A former border conscript whose hands shook as he spoke. He had been 19 in 1984, assigned to night patrols, trained to obey without context. He said he remembered that night because it broke something in him. He remembered a young woman being led away, not dragged, not running, but walking stiffly between two men, her face pale under the floodlights. He remembered an argument in hushed tones, a call made from a field phone, and then an order that did not come through the usual chain. He remembered being told to forget what he had seen, and how easily forgetting had been framed as survival. His testimony did not describe a killing. It described a transfer, a handoff, something procedural, almost banal, which made it worse, because procedures imply planning, approval, repetition. If Anya had been taken, she had been taken somewhere, and if she had been taken somewhere, then more people had known. The cold case expanded, no longer centered on a single suspect but on a system that could absorb a human being and leave no trace. Search teams revisited old sites, abandoned buildings near the former border, places repurposed or left to rot, listening to the ground as if it might remember. In one basement, sealed behind a false wall, they found remnants of an improvised holding cell, restraints rusted, a drain in the floor clogged with decades of dust. Forensic tests yielded nothing conclusive, but the space itself felt like an answer that refused to speak. Photographs leaked. Public outrage grew. People who had lived quietly for years felt the past tugging at their coats, demanding acknowledgement. Klaus Berger's calm began to crack under the accumulation. He changed lawyers. He stopped attending public events. Neighbors reported late-night visitors. Men who stayed briefly left no lights on. When questioned again, Berger corrected investigators on details he was not supposed to remember, revealing familiarity with operations that, according to him, had never existed. Each correction tightened the net, even as his defense argued age, memory decay, political scapegoating. The trial date loomed, a symbolic reckoning as much as a legal one. Yet even as the machinery of justice ground forward, something essential remained missing. Anya Richter herself. No body, no definitive cause of death. Only inference piled on inference, strong but incomplete. Her parents did not attend the press conferences. They watched from home, the television volume low, the faces of officials flickering across their living room like actors in a play that borrowed their grief but could never return it. For them, closure was not a word, it was a place they could not reach. Then came the revelation that fractured the narrative once more. A journalist, digging through private collections, uncovered a letter written in 1985, never mailed, found among the belongings of a now-deceased Stasi administrator. The letter referenced the Richter matter, described as unresolved, problematic, a liability. It mentioned a relocation, not a termination, a decision to keep the asset alive but inaccessible. The implications were seismic. If true, Anya might not have died that night. She might have disappeared into another life, another identity, another silence. Authorities moved quickly to discredit the letter, calling it speculative, unverified, dangerous. But the damage was done. The public imagination seized on the possibility, reshaping the story yet again. Sightings were reported, unreliable but persistent. A woman in Prague in the 90s, another in Rostock, always alone, always watching exits. The cold case, supposedly closed, pulsed back to life, no longer a question of guilt alone but of fate. As the trial approached, prosecutors narrowed their focus, choosing certainty over speculation, presenting a case of unlawful detention leading to death, supported by the weight of documents and testimony. They argued that whatever followed the transfer, Anya had not survived the system that swallowed her. The defense countered with absence, with doubt, with the impossibility of proving an end without a body. The courtroom became a theater of competing ghosts, each side invoking the past to claim the present. Outside, Berlin listened, restless. Murals appeared near the former wall, Anya's face rendered from old photographs, eyes looking past the viewer, challenging them to look back. Candles burned beneath plaques that had never existed before. People spoke openly now, stories tumbling out after years of restraint, fragments that did not always align but shared a common shape of fear. The city was remembering too much all at once, and memory, like truth, can be destabilizing. When the verdict finally came, it satisfied the legal threshold, a conviction that allowed the state to say the words it had prepared. Justice served, cold case closed. Applause rippled briefly, then faded, because the echo did not match the sound. Klaus Berger was led away, smaller somehow, but the questions remained standing, unmoved. What happened after the transfer? Who else signed off? How many files still slept in the wrong boxes? That night, the former border strip lay quiet under modern streetlights, cyclists passing where guard towers once stood, and somewhere in the city, a woman who would have been in her 60s if she were alive lingered in the collective imagination, unresolved. The case file bore a final stamp, ink drying over decades of delay, but Berlin knew better than to trust stamps. Some stories, once unearthed, refused to stay buried, and as the city settled into uneasy sleep, the sense persisted that the cold case had not ended, only changed shape, leaving behind an absence that no verdict could fill. The morning after the verdict felt quieter than it should have, as if the city were holding its breath, unsure whether to exhale or brace for another shock, because closure, once pronounced aloud, has a way of exposing everything it fails to contain. Berlin woke to headlines repeating the same phrase, cold case closed, but the words slid off the streets, refused to stick to the bricks and glass, and in the spaces between traffic and footfalls another narrative pressed forward, insistent, unfinished, demanding to be heard. Inside the courthouse, files were boxed and labeled, the Richter case prepared for archival rest, yet even there the sense of finality rang false. Junior clerks noticed discrepancies they had overlooked before, dates that did not align, signatures that appeared on documents created after their owners had supposedly left office. One clerk paused over a transit authorization stamped weeks after Anya vanished, granting passage through multiple checkpoints to a vehicle registered under a shell department. The destination line was blank. No one could explain why it had been preserved while other records from the same day were missing entirely. It was another loose thread, and this time it refused to be ignored. Journalists who had tasted the story's momentum did not let go. They followed pension records, traced property transfers, interviewed former officials who had learned, late in life, that silence no longer guaranteed safety. A pattern emerged of quiet rewards issued after the night in 1984, Apartments reassigned, promotions accelerated, illnesses treated discreetly. None of it proved murder, but it suggested compensation, the kind that follows compliance. Each revelation chipped away at the idea of a single perpetrator, reframing the crime as a collaborative act, diffused, normalized, protected by routine. The letter hinting at Anya's possible survival refused to fade, despite official dismissal. Linguists analyzed its phrasing, noting bureaucratic euphemisms used only in internal communications, terms too precise to be invented by an outsider. Handwriting experts debated its authenticity, divided but unsettled by its accuracy. And then there was the tone, not triumphant, not cruel but weary, as if the writer were documenting a problem he did not know how to solve, only how to move out of sight. If Anya had been relocated, it had not been an act of mercy. It had been containment. Attention shifted eastward, beyond Berlin, to facilities once used for off-the-books detentions, places that existed in rumor and denial, now half confirmed by crumbling blueprints and survivor testimony. In one such town, a retired nurse remembered treating a young woman brought in under guard, malnourished, silent, registered under a name that was not her own. The dates aligned closely enough to raise alarms. The description was frustratingly vague, yet something in the nurse's hesitation suggested fear that had never fully receded. When asked why she had never spoken before, she answered simply that no one had ever asked in a way that made her believe it was safe. Investigators requested access to remaining classified materials, only to discover an entire series of documents had been legally destroyed in the early 2000s, deemed redundant, obsolete, a housekeeping exercise that now looked deliberate in retrospect. What survived did so unevenly, pockets of truth surrounded by absence, a cartography of forgetting. Each destruction order bore approvals that traced back to the same small cluster of names, some now dead, others unreachable. Accountability dissolved into mortality, and the sense of time running out pressed hard against every inquiry. Klaus Berger, from his cell, issued a statement recanting nothing but clarifying much. He spoke of duty, of context, of threats unseen by those who judged him now. He denied killing Anya Richter but did not deny detaining her. He implied that her fate had been decided above his rank, that orders had arrived already shaped, requiring only execution. It was a partial admission wrapped in deflection, yet it cracked the narrative open just enough to let something darker seep through. If Berger had been a conduit rather than an origin, then the conviction marked an ending that had begun too late and stopped too soon. Public reaction splintered. Some accepted the verdict as necessary closure, a symbolic line drawn under a painful chapter. Others saw it as a convenient endpoint, a way to cap responsibility with a single aging man while the architecture that enabled him remained unexamined. Protests flared near former government buildings, placards bearing Anya's name alongside others long forgotten, a chorus of cases once buried under the same justifications. The past, it seemed, was not content with one reckoning. Amid the noise, Anya's parents retreated further from view. Their grief had matured into something dense and private, resistant to spectacle. When approached by a reporter with questions about the possibility that their daughter had lived, even briefly, her mother shook her head, not in denial but refusal. Hope, she said, was more dangerous now than despair. It reopened wounds that had learned, imperfectly, how to close. For them, the case had never been cold, never closed, only suspended in a long, aching present. A new task force was proposed, then stalled, then quietly abandoned amid political fatigue. The appetite for excavation waned as other crises claimed attention. Files that had been temporarily unsealed slipped back behind restrictions. The city moved on, as cities do, carrying its contradictions forward. But beneath the surface, the Richter case left a residue, altering how people understood the past, how they read official endings, how easily they accepted the word closed. Years later, a chance discovery reignited the unease. During renovations of a former administrative building slated for luxury apartments, workers uncovered a hidden compartment containing personal effects. A scarf, faded blue, a notebook warped by moisture, its pages filled with tight, anxious handwriting. The entries spoke of surveillance, of being followed, of fear escalating toward a date circled repeatedly. The final page ended mid-sentence. Forensic analysis dated the ink to the early 80s. The handwriting matched samples from Anya Richter's school records. The notebook did not answer what happened after that night, but it confirmed intent, awareness, danger recognized too late. It proved she had not wandered blindly into fate. She had been pushed toward it by forces she sensed but could not escape. The discovery reignited debate, forced officials to acknowledge that the case file they had sealed had never contained the whole truth. Statements were issued expressing regret, promises made to review procedures, to honor memory. They sounded familiar. Media attention flared briefly, then dimmed, leaving behind a sharper outline of uncertainty. The notebook was displayed once, then archived, its pages digitized and reduced to pixels, accessible but somehow less real. Klaus Berger died in custody before further questioning could occur, taking with him whatever clarifications he might have offered. Other potential witnesses passed away quietly, their stories expiring unrecorded. Time, relentless and impartial, continued its work. And yet, on certain nights, when the city grows still and the old border route is traced by cyclists and late trains, there is a sense that something unresolved moves alongside the present, a shadow cast by an absence that learned how to endure. The Richter case taught Berlin that endings declared too loudly often mask beginnings that have not been fully faced, that cold cases can be reopened, reframed, rebranded, but never truly closed if their core remains untouched. In the end, what survived was not a verdict or a headline, but a question sharpened by years of delay. How many lives were redirected, erased, or quietly repurposed in the name of order, and how many stories still wait in mislabeled boxes, patient, heavy, ready to surface when someone finally listens without flinching. The wall fell, the files thinned, the stamps dried, yet the echo of one vanished voice continued to ripple through Berlin, a reminder that some truths do not end. They linger, pressing against the present, asking not to be solved, but to be remembered. The story should have ended there, with the notebook cataloged and the echoes fading into the background noise of a city that had learned to live with its ghosts. But unresolved truths have a way of resurfacing when least expected, and Berlin, layered with history like sediment, offered no shortage of pressure points. The Richter case lingered not as a headline now, but as a low-frequency hum, perceptible only to those who had spent enough time listening for it, and it was among those listeners that the next rupture formed. It began with an audit no one had requested, a routine financial review of post-reunification compensation funds meant to reconcile administrative injustices from the former regime. Buried within spreadsheets and pension adjustments was an anomaly, a series of payments issued under a defunct program code, redirected through intermediaries consistent in amount and timing. The recipients shared no obvious connection on paper, but when cross-referenced against names that had brushed the edges of the Richter investigation, the pattern sharpened. These were not rewards. They were retainers, stretched thin across decades, designed not to enrich but to bind, to remind recipients that silence was still being purchased. The discovery reopened old wounds within the investigative community itself. Some of the officials who had pushed hardest for closure now faced questions about what they had chosen not to see. Others, younger, angrier, felt the weight of inheriting a compromised system, one that had learned how to protect itself across ideological transformations. Meetings grew tense. Files were re-examined with suspicion rather than trust. The cold case, it seemed, had metastasized into an indictment of institutional memory. A former accountant from the Ministry of State Security, long retired and living under a changed name, agreed to speak on record. His voice, steady but thin, described a mechanism he called continuity management, a way of ensuring that certain operations survived political shifts intact. He spoke of human assets reassigned, identities altered, lives compressed into narrow channels where deviation was impossible. When asked about Anya Richter, he did not hesitate. He said her name had appeared on lists marked unresolved, a category reserved for problems that could not be eliminated without consequence. The solution, he implied, was relocation into obscurity, a living erasure. The implication electrified the story once more. If Anya had lived, even briefly, then the crime extended far beyond a single night. It encompassed years stolen, choices denied, a life reduced to compliance or disappearance. Search efforts pivoted again, this time toward identity records from the late 80s and early 90s, asylum applications, hospital admissions, deaths under unknown names. The net cast was wide, and the results overwhelming, a sea of fragments that hinted at how many had slipped through similar cracks. One file stood out. A woman registered as deceased in 1991 under a false identity. Cause of death listed as respiratory failure, burial location unmarked. The medical notes referenced chronic stress, malnutrition, a history of detention. Photographs attached to the record were grainy, clinical, but something in the angle of the jaw, the spacing of the eyes, caught the attention of a forensic anthropologist. Facial reconstruction suggested a resemblance too close to ignore. The age progression matched. The timeline aligned. The possibility hung heavy, fragile, devastating. Authorities moved cautiously, aware of the damage that another reversal could cause. DNA testing was proposed, then stalled due to legal barriers and the absence of known remains from Anya Richter for comparison. Her parents were contacted once more, their response restrained, guarded by years of disappointment. They agreed to provide samples not out of renewed hope, but out of a desire to end the cycle of speculation that had taken on a life of its own. For them, uncertainty had become a form of violence. As the process crept forward, public interest surged and fractured. Some saw the renewed investigation as proof that truth, though delayed, was persistent. Others accused the state of manufacturing drama to mask its failures, of reopening wounds it had no intention of healing. The discourse grew bitter, reflective of a society still negotiating its relationship with a past that refused to stay past. In online forums and late-night radio shows, callers debated whether knowing was better than not knowing, whether some truths were too corrosive to pursue. Meanwhile, the former border strip continued its quiet transformation, cafes and apartments rising where watchtowers once loomed. Yet even in its modernity, the land seemed to resist forgetting. Construction crews reported unease working certain sites, as if the ground itself held a memory that could not be paved over. It was near one such site that a worker claimed to find a metal tag, stamped with a number corresponding to an intake registry from a detention facility long denied to have existed. The tag vanished before it could be authenticated, fueling suspicion and conspiracy in equal measure. Within the investigation team, fatigue set in. Leads proliferated faster than they could be verified. Each possibility carried emotional weight, the responsibility of not just solving a case but of redefining a narrative that had anchored itself in public consciousness. The question was no longer simply what happened to Anya Richter, but what acknowledging the full truth would require of those still alive. Accountability, reparations, admissions that could not be neatly contained within a verdict. The DNA results, when they finally arrived, were inconclusive. Degradation, contamination, insufficient markers. The answer remained just out of reach, close enough to ache. Official statements emphasized uncertainty, cautioning against definitive conclusions. The woman in the grave remained officially unnamed, another lost life among many. The Richter case hovered once more in a liminal state, neither resolved nor fully reopened, suspended by the limits of evidence and the passage of time. And yet, something had shifted irreversibly. The notion that the case was closed had eroded beyond repair. Each attempt to seal it only revealed more seams, more places where the past leaked into the present. Anya Richter had become more than a victim. She was a symbol of unfinished reckoning, of histories managed rather than confronted. Her story had forced Berlin to look not just at what had been done, but at how carefully it had been hidden, and how long that hiding had been honored. As night fell again over the city, the lights tracing the former wall glowed softly, an aesthetic gesture layered over a scar. Somewhere within that glow, the absence at the center of the Richter case persisted, unresolved, unyielding. Whether Anya had died that night or years later under another name, whether her last moments were brief or drawn out across stolen years, the truth remained incomplete, and that incompleteness pressed against the conscience of a city that had declared too many endings without listening to what still remained unsaid. By the time the investigation slipped back into uncertainty, the Richter case had already changed the way Berlin listened to its own silence, and silence, once noticed, is impossible to unhear. What followed was not an explosion of new evidence but a slow bleed of realization. The understanding that truth did not always arrive as revelation. Sometimes it crept in through patterns, through repetition, through the quiet admission that too many things had gone wrong in the same way for coincidence to survive. The task force, reduced in size but sharpened in focus, began mapping not events but behaviors, looking at how cases like Anya's had been handled, categorized, delayed, quietly suffocated. They compared files from different years, different districts, different victims, and found the same handwriting, the same phrasing, the same administrative fingerprints pressed lightly onto paper. Cold cases clustered around the wall years, especially those involving young people with no criminal record and no clear motive for disappearance. Each file told a different story, yet the endings felt eerily uniform, downgraded, archived, forgotten. An internal memo surfaced, never meant for public eyes, outlining a doctrine of risk minimization, a strategy that prioritized stability over accountability. Human variables, it stated, must be neutralized before they become catalysts. The language was bloodless, efficient, terrifying in its calm. Anya Richter's name was not mentioned, but the dates aligned, the philosophy fit. She was no longer an anomaly but an example, a data point in a system designed to erase friction. Former officials, sensing the tide had turned, began speaking in fragments, offering partial truths framed as confessions. One admitted that lists existed, lists of individuals deemed volatile, unpredictable, capable of drawing attention where none was desired. Another described a network of unofficial holding sites, places meant to delay rather than destroy, to wait out a problem until it dissolved. When pressed on what happened when it did not, he fell silent, the pause stretching long enough to become an answer. The Richter family watched these developments from a distance, their involvement reduced to occasional statements carefully stripped of emotion. For them, the story had already consumed enough of their lives. Yet privately, they revisited memories with a new lens, recalling moments that once seemed ordinary and now felt loaded. Anya's sudden caution, her habit of checking reflections in windows, the way she stopped writing letters and started making lists. The notebook had not been a diary. It had been preparation. A former university lecturer came forward, a man who had supervised Anya's studies and remembered her curiosity turning sharp, focused on systems, surveillance, the psychology of control. She had asked questions that made others uncomfortable, not loudly, but persistently. She had spoken about responsibility, about how power hid behind procedure. At the time, he had warned her to be careful. Now, he wondered if that warning had arrived already too late. As public pressure mounted, a parliamentary inquiry was proposed, broader than the Richter case, aimed at examining the legacy of covert operations that had bled into the post-reunification era. The proposal ignited fierce debate. Supporters argued that democracy demanded excavation, no matter how destabilizing. Opponents warned of reopening wounds, of undermining trust, of weaponizing history. The vote passed narrowly, a reluctant nod toward transparency that satisfied no one completely. Hearings began behind closed doors, testimony sealed, summaries released only after careful vetting. Names were redacted, dates blurred. Still, enough escaped to confirm what many had suspected. The machinery that swallowed Anya Richter had not been dismantled overnight. It had been repurposed, softened at the edges, but allowed to persist under new justifications. Accountability had been deferred, not denied, postponed until it became abstract, until those responsible could no longer answer. One testimony, leaked anonymously, described a woman who resisted relocation, who refused to cooperate, whose file carried annotations of frustration. The witness did not name her, but the description echoed details from Anya's notebook, her insistence on being seen, on being acknowledged as more than a variable. The witness claimed the woman was moved again, deeper into obscurity, after which her trail vanished. No execution order. No termination report. just absence. The ambiguity fractured public opinion further. Some clung to the hope that Anya had lived, that somewhere beyond the reach of records she had carved out a sliver of existence. Others rejected the idea, seeing it as another form of cruelty, a fantasy that delayed mourning. Both camps shared a common resentment toward the state, toward its ability to generate uncertainty and call it prudence. Meanwhile, the physical city continued to offer up fragments. During routine maintenance of an underground transit tunnel near the former border, workers uncovered markings etched into concrete, crude but deliberate. Symbols used by detainees to mark time, to count days, to assert presence in spaces designed to erase it. The markings were photographed, catalogued, then sealed over again, preserved but hidden, a compromise that felt emblematic of the entire process. Investigators attempted to trace the symbols, connecting them to other sites, other cases. A pattern emerged, faint but consistent, suggesting movement, a corridor of invisibility running beneath the official map. If Anya had been part of that corridor, her story intersected with many others, a collective narrative of displacement and quiet endurance. The cold case, once singular, had become plural, its weight multiplied by the realization that solving one would not resolve the rest. As months stretched into another year, momentum slowed. Funding thinned. Media attention drifted. The inquiry issued recommendations heavy on language and light on consequence. The Richter case receded from headlines again, not because it had been answered, but because it had become too complex, too uncomfortable to sustain. Closure, it seemed, was not denied but deferred, pushed just far enough into the future to dull its urgency. Yet beneath the surface, the story continued to exert pressure. Students studied it as a case of institutional failure. Artists incorporated its imagery into installations that asked viewers to confront absence as form. Tour guides paused longer near certain stretches of the former wall, lowering their voices, sharing fragments that did not make it into official scripts. Anya Richter became part of the city's unofficial curriculum, a lesson passed hand to hand, ungraded, unresolved. On the anniversary of her disappearance, a small gathering formed near Invalidenstrasse, candles flickering against the wind. No speeches were made. No demands shouted. Just names read aloud, not only Anya's, but others drawn into the gravity of her case. It was not a protest. It was an act of presence, a refusal to let erasure have the final word. Passers-by slowed, listened, some joining, others walking on, carrying the sound with them. In that moment, the Richter case felt less like a mystery to be solved and more like a mirror held up to the city, reflecting its discomfort with incomplete truths. Whether Anya had died that night, years later, or somewhere in between mattered, but not as much as what her disappearance revealed about the ease with which systems could rationalize disappearance itself. The wall was gone. The files were thinning. The witnesses were aging. Time continued its quiet work of smoothing edges. But the absence at the center of the story remained sharp, resistant to erosion. And as Berlin moved forward, building, rebranding, remembering selectively, the question persisted, not as an accusation, but as a challenge: how many endings had been declared simply because the cost of continuing felt too high, and how many cold cases, like Anya Richter's, were not waiting to be closed, but waiting to be fully faced. Time did not heal the Richter case. It reorganized it, breaking it into fragments that settled into different corners of the city's consciousness, waiting for the right conditions to collide again. What brought them back together was not outrage or discovery, but routine, the dull machinery of bureaucracy grinding forward until it struck something it could not process. A software migration, meant to modernize archival systems, flagged inconsistencies across digitized records, ghost entries that refused to reconcile, identities that existed in one database but not another. To the technicians, it was a technical nuisance. To those who knew where to look, it was a map of disappearance. Among the flagged anomalies was a cluster of provisional identities created between 1984 and 1986, all marked for restricted access, all sharing similar biometric placeholders rather than confirmed data. These were not errors. They were placeholders for people who had been intentionally blurred. One identity, generated weeks after Anya Richter vanished, showed a trail of controlled movements, medical check-ins, short-term housing allocations, all terminating abruptly in the early 90s. The endpoint was not death, not emigration, but null, a deliberate void where a life should have continued. The analyst who noticed the pattern hesitated before escalating it, aware of the weight such findings carried. When she did, the response was swift and contained. A small group convened, sworn to confidentiality, tasked with determining whether the anomalies represented unresolved crimes or residual administrative artifacts. The language mattered. Crime implied responsibility. Artifact implied inevitability. The debate over which word applied mirrored every argument the city had rehearsed for decades. They traced the provisional identity backward, mapping each interaction, each controlled point of contact. A clinic visit under guard. A reassignment to a textile cooperative that never existed on any public registry. A brief hospitalization following what was described as an adjustment episode. The notes were sparse, clinical, stripped of empathy. Nowhere did the name Anya Richter appear, yet the timeline echoed her disappearance too closely to dismiss. The question was no longer whether she had been taken, but how long she had been kept. The revelation fractured the remaining investigative cohesion. Some argued that pursuing the provisional identity risked undermining the already fragile consensus around the case, reopening legal challenges, destabilizing the conviction that had been achieved at such cost. Others insisted that ignoring it would repeat the very behavior the case had exposed, choosing administrative comfort over truth. The standoff lasted weeks, each side aware that delay itself was a decision. Outside official channels, word leaked. It always did. Independent journalists, historians, and activists pieced together what they could, correlating the provisional identity with testimonies gathered over years. A former social worker recalled a woman brought in under supervision, instructed never to ask questions, only to ensure compliance. She remembered the woman's eyes, alert, defiant even in exhaustion, and the way she asked, once, whether anyone would remember her real name. The social worker had not answered then. She did now, through tears, speaking into a recorder she never expected to hold. The possibility that Anya had lived into the reunified era reframed everything that followed. If she had survived the wall, then the silence afterward was not a relic of dictatorship but a choice made in freedom, a decision to let the machinery of forgetting continue unchallenged. That implication unsettled even those who had grown comfortable condemning the past. It suggested continuity where rupture had been promised. Pressure mounted for a formal reopening, not of the criminal case, but of the narrative itself. The question shifted from who killed Anya Richter to who allowed her to disappear twice, once into custody, and again into history. Parliamentary committees revisited old testimonies, this time reading between lines rather than along them. Language once accepted as neutral now sounded evasive. Omissions grew louder than statements. In the midst of this, a new witness emerged, not from the margins, but from the center of authority. A former legal advisor to the Interior Ministry, now terminally ill, requested to amend his testimony. His words were measured, precise, delivered with the clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime parsing language for impact. He spoke of legal gray zones exploited to manage inconvenient individuals, of emergency statutes stretched thin enough to cover actions never meant to be justified. He spoke of Anya Richter not as a victim, but as a problem, a person whose awareness posed a risk that could not be neutralized through persuasion. He confirmed the existence of relocation protocols, designed to render individuals functionally invisible without the finality of death. He admitted that oversight had been deliberately fragmented, so no single office held the full picture. And when asked what became of those relocated, he paused, long enough for the silence to register. Some adapted, he said. Some did not. Records were not always kept. The admission did not provide closure. It detonated it. Families of other missing individuals stepped forward, drawing parallels, demanding access to files long denied. The Richter case became a gateway, its gravity pulling other stories into orbit. Each carried its own details, its own pain, but the architecture was familiar. disappearance reframed as administrative necessity, suffering recast as collateral stability. Amid this widening reckoning, the provisional identity reached its null endpoint once more, this time under scrutiny. A review of burial records, long overlooked due to jurisdictional reshuffling, revealed a cremation authorized without next of kin, identity withheld, ashes unclaimed. The date fell within months of the provisional record's termination. The facility no longer existed. The paperwork was legally sound, emotionally void. DNA comparison was attempted again, using advanced techniques unavailable in earlier years. The results arrived quietly, without ceremony, a statistical probability rather than a declaration. Inconclusive but suggestive. Enough to reignite debate, not enough to end it. The Richter family was informed privately. The language careful, cautious, respectful of the harm certainty had already inflicted. They declined to comment. Their silence was not consent. It was fatigue. Public response oscillated between outrage and resignation. For some, the accumulation of evidence confirmed what they had always believed, that the truth had been sacrificed to convenience. For others, the complexity bred disengagement, a sense that the past was too tangled to be resolved meaningfully. Both reactions served the same outcome: delay. Yet delay did not mean erasure. The Richter case continued to infiltrate discourse in subtler ways. Legal scholars cited it in arguments about state power. Therapists referenced it when discussing generational trauma. Urban planners debated how memory should be embedded in space, whether absence could be acknowledged without being aestheticized. The case had escaped its file, embedding itself in the city's systems, a persistent reminder of unresolved responsibility. On the former border route, a small unofficial marker appeared overnight, a simple plaque bearing no dates, only a name. It was removed within hours, then replaced, then removed again. The cycle repeated, an unspoken dialogue between those who wanted the story contained and those who refused containment. Each removal acknowledged the same truth. The name still mattered. As winter settled in, the investigation slowed once more, its edges dulled by time, politics, and exhaustion. But something fundamental had shifted. The question was no longer whether the cold case was closed. That phrase had lost its authority. The question was whether closure, as it had been practiced, was ever an honest goal or merely a way to manage discomfort. In the quiet that followed, Berlin carried on, trains running, cafes filling, new histories being made atop old foundations. But beneath the rhythm of daily life, the Richter case persisted as a pressure point, a reminder that some stories resist resolution not because evidence is lacking, but because truth demands a reckoning too expansive to fit within a verdict. And as long as that reckoning remained incomplete, the case remained alive, not as a file, but as a question embedded in the city's bones, waiting for the moment when listening would finally outweigh the cost of knowing. By the 7th year after the verdict, the Richter case had ceased to be an investigation and become an atmosphere, something sensed rather than tracked, a shift in pressure that followed certain names, certain buildings, certain conversations that ended too abruptly. It no longer needed headlines to exist. It lived in footnotes, in pauses, in the way officials chose their words when asked about the past. The cold case had dissolved into the present, and the present did not know how to expel it. What reignited the tension was not a discovery, but an absence noticed too clearly to ignore. A tranche of records expected to accompany the provisional identity review never arrived. They were not classified. They were not destroyed. They were simply not there. The gap covered a narrow window, 18 months in the late 80s, exactly the period when relocation protocols were most active and oversight weakest. For archivists, missing records were common. For anyone who understood patterns, this absence screamed intention. A request was filed to locate the missing tranche. It moved slowly, caught in administrative loops, redirected, returned incomplete. Each delay carried a familiar flavor, a reminder that systems do not forget how to protect themselves. They only change the vocabulary of protection. The requesters escalated. Oversight bodies convened. Language sharpened. And still, the records did not surface. Then, without explanation, a partial set appeared, delivered anonymously to a journalist known for patience rather than spectacle. The package contained copies, not originals, stamped with obsolete seals, annotated in a hand that betrayed both urgency and caution. The documents outlined a series of relocations, transfers between facilities described only by code, each movement justified by assessments of psychological compliance. One entry, buried midway through, referenced a subject who retains identity fixation, resistant to reassignment narratives. The recommendation followed immediately: restrict exposure, minimize stimuli, extend observation. No name was attached. None was needed. The journalists sat on the documents for weeks, verifying what could be verified, aware that premature release could collapse the fragile trust of sources still speaking in whispers. When the story finally broke, it did not accuse. It asked. It placed the documents alongside known timelines, known testimonies, and let the alignment speak for itself. The reaction was swift and polarized. Some dismissed it as recycled speculation. Others felt the old unease return, sharpened by specificity. Within days, a former facility supervisor reached out, his message brief, cautious, unmistakably afraid. He agreed to meet in a public place, surrounded by noise, where secrets could hide in plain sight. He spoke of a woman who arrived under escort, already worn thin, already aware that her name was a liability. He described how she refused to adopt the identity assigned to her, how she corrected staff when they addressed her incorrectly, insisting on being called Anya. The name, he said, made people uncomfortable. It reminded them that what they were managing was not an abstraction. He recalled disciplinary reports filed not for violence or escape attempts, but for questions. She asked about dates, about jurisdiction, about who had signed the orders that governed her life. She asked whether the wall still stood. When told it did, she laughed, a sound he described as startling in its clarity. That laughter, he said, stayed with him longer than anything else. According to his account, her resistance triggered a transfer, deeper into the network, to a place he never visited and could not describe beyond its isolation. After that, her file left his purview. He never saw her again. When asked why he was speaking now, he looked away and said only that silence had started to feel heavier than consequence. The testimony did not deliver certainty. It delivered texture. It transformed Anya Richter from a symbol back into a presence. A person who had pushed back, who had insisted on being recognized even as systems closed around her. For many, that insistence reframed the entire case. She was no longer only a victim of erasure. She was an active force resisting it. Public discourse shifted subtly. The question was no longer whether Anya had lived or died, but how long she had been allowed to be herself before being crushed by containment. That distinction mattered. It recast the crime not as a moment, but as a process, one that unfolded across months or years, sustained by routine decisions made by people who went home at night and slept. Legal scholars began arguing that the Richter case represented a category error in justice, that traditional frameworks built around discrete acts could not account for crimes of prolonged disappearance. They spoke of time as harm, of duration as violence. Their arguments filtered into courtrooms, into academic journals, into policy debates that circled the same unresolved core. Meanwhile, the state responded with familiar restraint. Statements acknowledged complexity, emphasized the difficulty of retroactive accountability, reaffirmed commitment to transparency without specifying mechanisms. New review panels were announced, their mandates narrow, their timelines undefined. The machinery of response whirred into motion, impressive in appearance, ambiguous in effect. For those who had followed the case closely, it felt like choreography learned long ago. Anya's parents, now elderly, declined further interviews. Friends who had once spoken eagerly retreated into privacy, wary of seeing her story consumed again by cycles of revelation and retreat. The Richter name had become powerful, and power attracts distortion. Those closest to it chose distance as a form of preservation. Still, the city remembered in its own ways. A performance artist staged a piece along the former border route, walking the length of it while reading excerpts from relocation protocols in a calm, bureaucratic tone, juxtaposed with fragments from Anya's notebook. The contrast was brutal, the effect unsettling. Viewers described feeling complicit, implicated by the ease with which procedure could eclipse humanity. In quiet offices, analysts continued to trace the network that had held her, mapping connections that extended beyond borders, beyond regimes. They found cooperation agreements, information exchanges justified by security concerns, evidence that disappearance did not always stop at the wall. The Richter case widened again, stretching into a transnational space where responsibility blurred and accountability thinned. One night, a former intelligence liaison left a message on an answering machine, his voice distorted by age and fear. He claimed knowledge of a final transfer, an unofficial handoff that occurred after reunification, when old structures were dissolving and new ones had not yet solidified. He suggested that Anya, or someone believed to be her, had been moved one last time, not to detain, but to disappear completely. No facility, no record, just release into anonymity, unsupported, unacknowledged. Whether this was mercy or abandonment, he could not say. He had never known. The message ended abruptly. Follow-up attempts failed. The number went dead. The claim could not be substantiated. It joined the growing archive of near answers that define the case. Each one brought the truth closer while ensuring it remained just out of reach. As winter gave way to spring, the Richter case entered a new phase, quieter but no less charged. It was no longer driven by discovery, but by accumulation, the slow weight of evidence pressing against denial. No single piece could resolve it. Together, they formed a shape too clear to ignore, even if its edges remained blurred. The phrase cold case closed began to sound hollow, a relic of an earlier attempt to impose finality where none existed. What remained was a recognition, unspoken but shared, that Anya Richter had exposed something fundamental about power and memory, about the ease with which lives could be managed into absence, and the difficulty of undoing that management once it had succeeded. Berlin moved forward, as it always had, layering new narratives atop old scars. But beneath those layers, the Richter case endured, not as an open file, but as an unresolved responsibility. It asked no longer for a killer's name or a date of death. It asked whether a society could acknowledge harm that unfolded too slowly, too quietly, to fit its definitions of crime. And in that question, persistent and unresolved, Anya Richter remained present, her name no longer confined to archives or plaques, but woven into the city's ongoing negotiation with its past. A reminder that some cases do not demand answers so much as they demand honesty, and that honesty, once delayed too long, becomes the most unsettling truth of all. By the time the 8th chapter of the Richter case began to take shape, no one announced it. There was no press release, no leaked document dramatic enough to force a reckoning. What changed was subtler, more dangerous. People inside the system began to speak to one another differently, with fewer assumptions of safety, with the careful precision of those who sensed that the past was no longer content to remain theoretical. The case had crossed a threshold, from historical inquiry into something active, something capable of reaching forward as well as back. It started with a closed seminar at a legal institute, invitation only, framed as an academic discussion on state continuity and transitional justice. Halfway through, a participant posed a question that landed like a blade slipped between ribs. If prolonged disappearance constituted an ongoing crime, did the statute of limitations ever truly begin? The room went still. Notes paused mid-sentence. Because if the answer was no, then responsibility had not expired. It had merely been deferred. From that moment, the Richter case acquired a new gravity. It was no longer anchored solely to 1984 or the Wall era. It extended legally and morally into the present. That reframing unsettled more than any document ever could. It implied that those who had chosen silence after reunification were not passive inheritors of a dark past, but participants in its continuation. A small group of prosecutors, younger, less invested in the narratives that had defined earlier decades, began exploring the implications quietly. They reviewed decisions made in the 90s, cases not pursued, files reclassified, testimonies deemed unreliable without explanation. Patterns emerged, not of conspiracy, but of convenience. Each choice defensible in isolation, devastating in aggregate. They focused on one administrative act in particular, a 1993 directive allowing unresolved security cases to be archived indefinitely if no immediate threat was identified. The language was neutral, procedural, but attached to the directive was a list of cases reviewed under its authority. Anya Richter's name appeared there, not as a victim, but as a resolved risk. The phrasing was chilling in its simplicity. It suggested that whatever she had become by then, alive or dead, she was no longer considered destabilizing. The problem had been managed. That document shifted the center of the story again. It suggested a decision point years after the wall fell, a moment when officials could have chosen disclosure and instead chose burial. The cold case, supposedly closed by the Berger conviction, now appeared to have been closed once before, deliberately, quietly, by people operating in daylight rather than shadow. When the directive surfaced publicly, reaction was immediate and visceral. Survivors of other unresolved cases recognized the mechanism instantly. They had lived its consequences. Press conferences followed, raw and unpolished, families standing shoulder to shoulder, holding photographs that had aged faster than their grief. The Richter case was no longer singular. It had become a key that unlocked a wider pattern of deferred justice. Within government offices, tension hardened into fear. Legal counsel circulated memos warning against speculation, against retroactive interpretation, against moral overreach. The words were careful, but the urgency beneath them was unmistakable. Lines were being redrawn, and no one knew where responsibility would ultimately settle. In the midst of this, a final, unexpected witness emerged, not with testimony, but with material. A former records courier, now living abroad, contacted an advocacy group with a claim he had carried something he was never meant to understand. Decades earlier, during the chaotic months of reunification, he had been tasked with transferring sensitive files between agencies, instructed not to read, not to linger. One package, heavier than the rest, had split open in transit. Inside, he saw photographs, not surveillance stills, portraits, identification images taken at intervals, documenting change. He described one face in particular, a woman photographed repeatedly over several years, her expression shifting from defiant to withdrawn to something harder to name. Each image bore a different name beneath it. The courier did not know the names then. He knew only that the eyes remained the same. When shown photographs of Anya Richter years later, he recognized them immediately. The resemblance, he said, was not just physical. It was emotional. The originals were gone, destroyed in a later purge. But the memory endured, vivid enough to withstand cross-examination. Investigators pressed him on dates, on context, on possibility of error. He answered steadily, without embellishment. He had no motive, no gain. He had carried the images. He had never forgotten them. This testimony did not prove survival. Proved process. It confirmed that someone had been documented, managed, tracked across time, long after the night of disappearance. For many, that was worse than death. It meant that whatever happened to Anya Richter was not a failure of control, but an exercise of it. The state responded defensively. Spokespeople emphasized the unreliability of memory, the danger of retroactive projection. They acknowledged suffering without admitting causation. It was a familiar posture, but its effectiveness was waning. The accumulation of near certainties had begun to outweigh the comfort of doubt. In private, officials debated strategy. Full disclosure risked legal exposure and institutional collapse. Continued restraint risked something harder to contain, a loss of legitimacy. The Richter case had become a moral litmus test, not because it was unique, but because it was so clearly documented in fragments. Every attempt to minimize it only highlighted how much had been normalized. Anya Richter herself began to reappear in the narrative not as a missing person, but as a thinker, a questioner. Scholars revisited her academic work, her notes, her questions about systems and power. She was reframed not as someone who stumbled into danger, but as someone who recognized it and refused to look away. That reframing altered the emotional core of the story. Her disappearance was no longer tragic coincidence. It was confrontation. Public art shifted accordingly. Murals no longer depicted her as a passive victim, but as a figure in motion, eyes forward, mouth open as if mid-question. The imagery unsettled. It challenged viewers not to mourn, but to respond. As pressure mounted, a proposal surfaced that once would have been unthinkable. A truth commission with binding powers, able to compel testimony, override classification, recommend prosecution. It faced fierce opposition. It also gained unexpected support from younger lawmakers who understood that inherited silence was not sustainable. The vote was delayed, then delayed again, each postponement reinforcing the sense that time itself had become a tactic. Meanwhile, the Richter family received a private letter, and signed, containing a single sentence. She did not stop asking. No explanation. No proof. Just the assertion, heavy with implication. They never confirmed its receipt, but those close to them noticed a change, subtle but profound. The question of survival seemed to matter less than the confirmation of resistance. By now, the case had moved beyond resolution in any traditional sense. There would be no single revelation capable of closing it, no body, no confession that could absorb its meaning. Instead, it functioned as a fault line, revealing stresses wherever it surfaced, exposing the cost of choosing order over truth. As Berlin continued its relentless forward motion, new crises demanding attention, the Richter case refused to recede. It lingered in academic debates, legal reforms, whispered conversations between those who had lived too close to the machinery of erasure. It was no longer about what had happened to one woman, but about what had been done, repeatedly, quietly, with full awareness of consequence. The phrase cold case closed had become almost ironic, a marker of how badly language could fail when pressed into service of denial. What remained was not closure, but responsibility, unfulfilled and persistent. And in that persistence, Anya Richter endured, not as a ghost, but as a presence that refused to be neutralized, a reminder that some stories do not end when the file is sealed, but begin to matter only once the silence around them finally starts to break. By the 9th year, the Richter case had become less a question of evidence and more a phenomenon, a constant vibration beneath the city's daily life, a pressure point in the collective memory of Berlin. It existed in the pauses between news cycles, in the cautious phrasing of officials, in the lingering gaze of those who knew that the machinery of the past had been capable of making a person vanish without ever truly releasing them. The cold case had evolved from mystery to presence, its absence now unmistakably loud. It began with a single email, sent to an investigative journalist known for precision rather than sensation. The sender claimed access to correspondence from a now-retired intelligence officer, letters never logged, never archived, sent between facilities during the late 80s. They were mundane in content, logistics, staffing, but one phrase repeated with subtle variation. Subject remains resolute. Identity persists. The sender provided scans, timestamps, and context sufficient to verify authenticity. The implication was undeniable. Whoever Anya Richter had become, she had resisted erasure, maintained a sense of self despite enforced obscurity. This revelation rippled instantly, not because it provided resolution, but because it reframed the nature of the crime. It was no longer merely a disappearance. It was an attempt at systemic nullification, a slow, deliberate pressure applied over months or years. The past conviction, the closure once celebrated, now seemed like a footnote to a larger, more insidious process. Former colleagues of Richter were interviewed anew. A professor who had taught her philosophy of systems described how she had questioned authority in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, persistent in asking who controlled outcomes and how compliance was measured. He remembered her notebooks, filled with sketches of flowcharts and lists, abstract diagrams of power, surveillance, and decision-making. At the time, it had seemed like theoretical exercise. Now, in retrospect, it felt like preparation. The authorities responded with predictably measured caution. Statements emphasized adherence to legal frameworks and procedural integrity, highlighting the difficulty of retroactively adjudicating actions taken under a now-defunct regime. Yet the public sensed a shift. The veneer of control had thinned, and even without legal consequence, the moral weight of action lingered. A breakthrough came unexpectedly. During a review of declassified surveillance logs, an analyst noticed a pattern of communications between facilities in different districts, a chain of encrypted messages whose frequency spiked precisely during periods when Anya Richter was recorded as missing. The content of the messages could not be fully decrypted, but metadata alone suggested coordination, deliberate tracking, management of an individual whose presence was inconvenient yet persistent. The historian who had compiled timelines of Cold War disappearances compared the logs with other unresolved cases and found an uncanny alignment. Multiple subjects, all young, all nonviolent, all connected by patterns of administrative oversight designed to render them invisible. Anya Richter was no anomaly. She was the template, the exemplar. Each step in her disappearance had been rehearsed, catalogued, normalized. Public reaction intensified. Media outlets ran side-by-side analyses, contrasting the Berger conviction with the procedural erasure revealed by the new evidence. Opinion columns debated not guilt or innocence, but intent and responsibility. How long could a society permit absence to be administered as a form of order before that absence became a crime in itself? Former officials, sensing exposure, began to fracture. Some spoke in partial confessions, framing actions as mistakes or miscommunications. Others insisted that everything had been done according to protocol, each decision defensible by the logic of bureaucracy. When asked what became of Anya Richter, responses diverged. Some implied release, others hinted at death, most offered silence. Silence, it became clear, was itself a tool, a continuation of the very process that had defined the case from the beginning. Meanwhile, those outside government sought other evidence. A photographer who had captured Berlin in the late 80s found in his archive a series of images taken near the former border. At first glance, they were mundane urban shots. Streets, trains, passers-by. On closer inspection, one figure recurred. Blonde, medium height, cautious gaze, appearing at different locations, different times, as if shadowing herself. The journalist who reviewed the photos noted the uncanny resemblance to Richter, a silent witness threading through public life, always present but never acknowledged. The public imagination seized on this fragmentary evidence. Social media and online forums debated the implications. Had Richter survived in anonymity? Was she complicit, coerced, resisting in silence? Or was she a ghost, her identity co-opted by forces that had erased her presence from the narrative entirely? The questions proliferated faster than answers could be found. Legally, the case remained frozen. Statutes of limitations prevented prosecution for actions taken during the Wall era. Yet the symbolic weight of the revelations drove policy discussions. How could future disappearances be prevented? How could systems be designed so that absence was never again weaponized as a tool of control? The Richter case had become an ethical benchmark, a yardstick for transparency and accountability. Inside the city, the case left subtle traces. Archivists handling sensitive documents began inserting cautionary notes. Museum curators contextualized artifacts of the Wall with references to administrative disappearance. University courses on political ethics used Richter as a case study, emphasizing procedural harm rather than direct violence. The cold case had entered the educational framework of memory. Even the urban environment bore the imprint. Near former wall sites, unofficial plaques and memorials appeared overnight, bearing only her name, or initials, or cryptic phrases like, "presence persisted." These markers were repeatedly removed by authorities and returned by unknown individuals, creating a cycle of recognition and erasure that mirrored the very history under scrutiny. Psychologically, the case became a lens through which Berliners examined their own complicity and attentiveness. Stories circulated of neighbors, colleagues, friends who had observed something out of place during the Wall years, dismissed it, and later recognized its significance in light of Richter's persistence. The city itself was forced into introspection. How many absences had gone unchallenged? How many lives had been quietly erased or managed into invisibility? Then, an archivist reported discovering a series of handwritten annotations in the margins of files previously thought mundane. The notes were terse, almost cryptic. Resists compliance. Name maintained. Must monitor. Repeated across different locations and dates, these annotations revealed the continuity of attention and the deliberate maintenance of oversight. Anya Richter had not simply disappeared. She had been tracked, studied, and cataloged over time, her identity recognized even when publicly denied. This discovery reignited public debate. Commentators framed it not as an isolated failure, but as a structural phenomenon, a blueprint of administrative erasure that demanded moral reckoning. Schools incorporated discussions of procedural harm into history and ethics curricula. Activists organized events highlighting continuity of state power over individual autonomy. The Richter case became emblematic, a signal flare in a city accustomed to forgetting. And yet, despite all the accumulated evidence, the final truth remained elusive. The question of Anya Richter's fate, whether she survived, whether she resisted, whether she vanished entirely, remained unanswered. What endured was the pattern, the awareness that disappearance could be systematically managed, that identity could be both preserved and nullified simultaneously, and that such management left scars far deeper than any single act of violence could inflict. In that tension, the coexistence of evidence and absence, certainty and ambiguity, the Richter case found its enduring power. It no longer required resolution to matter. Its presence was moral, emotional, social. It was a cold case that refused closure, a story embedded in the city's consciousness, in the architecture of memory, in the quiet understanding that some absences, like echoes, do not fade, they resonate. Berlin lived around it, through it, and because of it. And in that resonance, the city and its people were forced to confront a question that no verdict could answer. How much of the past could truly be managed without surrendering the humanity it contained? By the 10th year, the Richter case had transformed into a force that operated outside conventional timelines, slipping through the cracks of official narratives and infiltrating the city's consciousness in ways no one could contain. It was no longer merely a cold case. It had become a living question, one that lingered in bureaucratic corridors, whispered in cafes, felt in the silence between neighbors who remembered too much or too little. The machinery of erasure, once so precise, now revealed its own imperfections, its blind spots, its inevitability of exposure. It began with the rediscovery of a series of coded communications long overlooked, sent between former intelligence officers and social service administrators during the late war years. At first glance, they appeared routine, detailing assignments, transfers, and compliance assessments. But a pattern emerged. One subject was referenced repeatedly, not by name, but by consistent descriptors: blonde, medium build, alert eyes, persistent identity. Cross-referencing these descriptors with archival photographs and notes made decades earlier revealed a convergence too precise to ignore. Anya Richter had been monitored systematically, her existence cataloged as both presence and problem. The revelation did more than reignite interest. It reframed the narrative entirely. No longer was the question merely who had taken her or whether she had survived. The focus shifted to method, intent, and moral complicity. Each bureaucratic decision, each administrative directive, each seemingly mundane memo revealed the meticulous orchestration behind enforced absence. Anya Richter had become a case study in controlled invisibility, a cautionary tale of what happens when systems prioritize order over human life. Investigators sought to trace the logistics of her management, reviewing facility assignments, internal communications, and personnel rotations. One analyst discovered a chain of transfers that suggested intentional obfuscation. Files shuffled between departments, dates altered subtly, identities reassigned with the precision of code. Every move minimized risk to the system while maximizing the individual's erasure. The implication was undeniable. Survival and existence could be monitored and neutralized simultaneously. Witnesses began to emerge, tentatively at first. A former courier, now living abroad, recalled transporting sealed envelopes between facilities during the chaotic years of reunification. He described glimpsing photographs of a woman whose eyes were arresting, unyielding, familiar. He did not know her name at the time. Decades later, when shown images of Anya Richter, he confirmed, without hesitation, that it was her. The eyes remained the same. The persistence of identity, even when legally and socially suppressed, became a focal point of inquiry. The case, already dense with procedural complexity, now took on a symbolic dimension. Lawyers debated whether prolonged disappearance constituted an ongoing crime, whether administrative control could ever be disentangled from personal accountability. Philosophers and ethicists framed Richter as a living critique of systemic power, someone who resisted nullification simply by existing. Her name, once absent from public discourse, began appearing in lectures, conferences, and publications, cited not merely as a victim, but as a figure of endurance. As public awareness grew, so did scrutiny of the systems that had enabled her disappearance. Former officials, some fearful, others defensive, began to fracture in their accounts. Testimonies diverged. Some implied release, others hinted at death, most invoked silence. The pattern itself became the story, revealing a methodical orchestration of erasure that could exist without acknowledgement. Silence, in this context, was not neutral, it was a continuation of control. Photographers and archivists contributed fragments of evidence. One photographer uncovered images from late 80s Berlin, unremarkable urban scenes at first glance. Yet upon closer inspection, a familiar figure appeared repeatedly, present but unnoticed, always moving carefully through the frame. Online forums debated her identity, reconstructing her path from fragmentary visual and textual evidence, attempting to map the unseen thread of her life. The public became a participant in piecing together an existence deliberately concealed. In parallel, a series of handwritten marginalia was discovered in previously mundane administrative files. Terse annotations such as "identity persists," "monitor" repeated across locations and dates. These notes confirmed continuity, deliberate oversight, and the conscious preservation of information on a person officially declared absent. It was both confirmation and indictment. The machinery of control had acknowledged her resistance while continuing to suppress it. Legal experts began to argue that Richter's case represented a form of temporal injustice. Harm not defined by a single act but extended across months or years, a slow, pervasive manipulation of life itself. Public discourse responded with a mix of outrage and reflection. Families of other missing individuals drew parallels, framing the Richter case as emblematic of broader systemic failures. The story had become less about closure and more about accountability, moral and institutional. Amidst this unfolding reckoning, the phrase "cold case closed" lost all meaning. The Richter case had never truly ended. It was not a matter of evidence or resolution but of awareness and acknowledgement. Berlin itself had become a witness, its streets, archives, and public spaces repositories of a story that refused to be sanitized. Artists, historians, and activists wove the narrative into exhibitions, performances, and publications, ensuring that the lessons of persistence, erasure, and resistance would endure. The family received occasional, cryptic communications, an unsigned note here, a photograph there, reminders that the past had not released them. They maintained privacy, choosing silence as protection, but those close to them observed subtle shifts. A recognition that the persistence of their daughter's identity mattered more than any answer to her fate. It was not survival in the conventional sense, but a moral presence that demanded acknowledgement. As the 10th year drew to a close, the Richter case stood as a paradox. Fully documented yet unresolved, widely discussed yet partially concealed, historically situated yet profoundly contemporary. It functioned as a mirror, reflecting not only what had been done to one individual, but what a society was capable of tolerating when convenience, bureaucracy, and fear eclipsed humanity. The cold case had never been merely about disappearance. It had always been about the persistence of presence in the face of systematic erasure, a reminder that some absences, carefully managed, are more telling than any confession or conviction could ever be. Berlin continued to live atop its history, the wall gone but its shadow enduring. Streets bustled, cafes filled, new lives unfolded. Yet beneath the rhythm, the Richter case persisted as a pulse in the city's consciousness. Not a question to be answered, but a reality to be acknowledged. That some lives, no matter how controlled or suppressed, resist being forgotten. And in that resistance, Anya Richter remained present, an unyielding reminder that the machinery of erasure can be challenged simply through persistence, through the refusal to vanish from memory, and through the enduring moral pressure her story imposes on all who encounter it. By the 11th year, the Richter case had ceased to exist in conventional terms. It was no longer a file, no longer a headline, no longer a cold case in the legal sense. It had become a force, an undercurrent running through Berlin's collective memory, a shadow in the corridors of power, a whisper in archives, and a weight in the conscience of anyone who had ever turned away from inconvenient truth. The city itself had absorbed it, and in turn, it had reshaped the city, quietly, persistently, as if the past refused to yield until it had been fully reckoned with. It began with a series of unmarked envelopes delivered to the offices of investigative journalists, archivists, and activists. Each contained fragments: a ledger page, a partial photograph, a handwritten note, a date. On their own, they seemed insignificant, almost meaningless, but together, they formed a lattice of events, actions, and presences that had once been hidden in the bureaucratic shuffle. The name Anya Richter threaded through them like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken tension. Analysts reconstructed patterns from these fragments: transfers between facilities, inconsistencies in record-keeping, discrepancies in personnel logs, all pointed to deliberate orchestration. Not a single act stood alone. Instead, a slow, methodical process unfolded, one designed to erase visibility without ever explicitly acknowledging it. It was the architecture of absence, the construction of invisibility, a bureaucratic choreography so precise it could almost be admired, if it weren't so horrifying. A former facility supervisor came forward, speaking under strict conditions of anonymity. He described procedures designed to obscure movement, to minimize recognition, to prevent traceable interactions. He admitted to seeing Richter only once, in a hallway, but noted the impression she left. Unwavering, perceptive, refusing to conform even in an environment designed to make compliance absolute. She watched everything, he said, but never let them watch her entirely. These words resonated. They framed Richter not as a victim but as a participant in a long, silent struggle. A person who resisted erasure through presence, through attention, through maintaining her identity even when every system conspired to erase it. Her persistence became the narrative's axis. Not the crime itself, but the endurance of self in the face of systematized disappearance. Legal and ethical scholars dissected the implications. Could harm be measured across years rather than incidents? Could responsibility extend beyond the individuals who committed acts to the networks and institutions that sustained them? The Richter case became a benchmark for thinking about ongoing crimes, procedural violence, and the moral weight of silence. Its cold case status was revealed as a misnomer, a superficial label masking a deeper, continuous injustice. Meanwhile, the public engaged in acts of remembrance that were unconventional yet powerful. Anonymous murals appeared along streets once part of the wall's shadow, depicting a figure in motion, determined, eyes alert. Performances staged in former administrative buildings reconstructed procedural routines, highlighting the quiet violence of disappearance and the extraordinary courage required simply to survive within it. Berlin itself became a canvas for collective reckoning, a city learning to acknowledge a presence that had never truly been absent. A breakthrough emerged when a series of declassified intelligence cables were reviewed by an international consortium of historians. They revealed coordination across multiple agencies and even national borders, each step carefully documented, each action justified as necessary for stability. Within this network, Anya Richter's file appeared repeatedly, annotated with observations about her awareness, resistance, and intelligence. The pattern was clear. She had not simply vanished. She had been managed, catalogued, and observed, her agency both restricted and acknowledged. This revelation intensified moral and legal debate. The notion of disappearance as crime was reframed. It was not simply the act of taking someone, but the deliberate orchestration of ongoing control, the imposition of absence as a tool of authority. Questions of culpability expanded from individual actors to systemic responsibility. The Richter case, once treated as a singular historical curiosity, now served as a mirror reflecting institutional ethics, human rights, and societal complicity. The family remained largely silent, their privacy fiercely guarded. Yet occasional signals, an unsigned letter, a discreet acknowledgement from a former colleague, confirmed that Richter's story had endured beyond the official record. They conveyed a subtle truth. Survival was less about physical presence than persistence of identity, the maintenance of self despite deliberate attempts at erasure. The moral force of this endurance became the case's defining feature. In parallel, investigative journalists traced the broader implications, uncovering additional cold cases with similar procedural footprints. Individuals cataloged, managed, and quietly removed from public view. Richter's case provided a framework, a lens through which these previously isolated disappearances could be understood as part of a systemic pattern. It was no longer an anomaly but a revelation of method, a chilling example of how control could be normalized, bureaucratized, and rendered invisible. By the end of the 11th year, the Richter case had acquired an almost mythic quality. It resisted closure not because the facts were incomplete, but because its significance transcended simple resolution. It was about presence within absence, identity under erasure, memory within silence. The phrase "cold case closed" was revealed as inadequate, misleading, almost a lie. The truth of the Richter case was that it had never been closed. It had only grown in moral weight, persisting as an enduring challenge to society, to law, and to conscience. Berlin moved on visibly. New developments, reconstruction, modernization. But beneath the surface, the Richter case persisted, embedded in the city's architecture of memory, in the whispered stories, in the archival dust, in the faint imprint of presence that refused to be ignored. It had become a question the city could not answer, a moral vibration running through streets, offices, and classrooms alike. And in that ongoing presence, Anja Richter existed, not as a figure to be located, not as a body to be discovered, but as a testament to endurance, a reminder that systems of power can manage absence but cannot fully extinguish the persistence of self. Her story, once considered a mystery, had evolved into a perpetual lesson, that even in enforced invisibility, identity endures, resistance persists, and some cold cases never truly close. They live on, shaping conscience, memory, and the very moral framework of the society that tried to make them disappear. Years later, the Richter case had settled into something almost like legend, though it was a legend grounded in documents, testimonies, and the faint traces of a life that refused erasure. Berlin had rebuilt, modernized, expanded, but every corner, every street, every shadow of the former wall whispered the story. The cold case was no longer simply about Anja Richter. It had become a prism through which the city examined itself, a measure of its capacity for justice, conscience, and memory. It began with whispers in archives that had long been considered closed. Scholars, journalists, and retired officials discovered inconsistencies. Files that had been annotated, then removed, then partially restored. One particular folder contained dozens of unmarked photographs of a woman, moving through offices, streets, trains, her face consistent yet her identity fragmented by administrative labels. Metadata suggested some images were taken years after her disappearance, and while verification remained impossible, the photographs carried an undeniable intensity. She was alive, alert, unbowed, and always aware of observation. The city felt the weight of her story in subtle ways. Memorials sprouted along former borderlines, small plaques and graffiti blending into the urban fabric, bearing her initials, her date of birth, cryptic phrases. Presence persists, identity endures, she asked, and we must answer. These messages were anonymous but persistent, returning even after authorities attempted removal, as if the city itself insisted that she not be forgotten. Investigators and ethicists debated the concept of temporal responsibility. Could the moral weight of a crime persist decades after the fact? Could institutions be held accountable for choices that had been legal but deeply unethical? The Richter case had become a template for these discussions, a benchmark for modern justice, showing that absence could be weaponized, silence could be a tool, and endurance could be a form of resistance stronger than confession. Private individuals contributed their own fragments of memory. Former neighbors recalled fleeting glimpses. A woman slipping quietly down a stairwell, always alert, always moving as if she were both present and invisible. Former colleagues described encounters that had seemed mundane at the time but, in retrospect, were filled with subtle defiance. Every recollection reinforced the image of Richter as a force rather than a victim, a person whose presence persisted even when legally denied. Meanwhile, the archives continued to yield surprises. Handwritten marginalia, long dismissed as clerical notes, were revealed as deliberate documentation. Observed, identity maintained, continues to resist normalization. These fragments showed not only procedural oversight but conscious acknowledgement. She had been watched, catalogued, and yet her autonomy had been impossible to erase completely. It was the persistence of human will against the machinery of invisibility, a quiet victory that remained undramatized yet morally profound. The public, too, had absorbed the story in ways unexpected. Writers, filmmakers, and artists drew inspiration from her endurance. Stage performances recreated the silent tension of her daily existence under observation. Photographic exhibitions juxtaposed ordinary city life with anonymous figures whose presence seemed impossible to ignore. She had become a lens through which Berlin, and even the world, examined the ethical cost of control, bureaucracy, and silence. Even the language of law began to shift. Scholars introduced concepts like continuous harm and administrative disappearance into discussions of human rights. Cold cases were redefined not merely as unresolved crimes but as moral and ethical failures across time. Richter's case was cited in international forums as a cautionary tale. The crime was not only the act of taking, but the deliberate, patient orchestration of absence, the use of systems to deny identity while preserving the illusion of order. The family, long private and cautious, acknowledged the public resonance without entering debate. Occasional anonymous messages reached them. A photo, a note, a fragment of writing, always affirming her persistence. They came to understand that the story's power did not lie in closure but in endurance. Their daughter had become a moral presence, a reminder, a test, a symbol that absence could not fully erase accountability. By now, the Richter case had transcended the ordinary arc of crime narratives. It was not a story that could be solved in a single revelation or dramatic confession. It was a force embedded in memory, policy, art, and conscience. Every discussion of governance, every debate on surveillance and ethics, every historical inquiry carried the echo of a life that had refused to vanish entirely. And yet, the question of her ultimate fate, alive or dead, remained unanswered. The mystery persisted not because evidence was lacking, but because the case had become about something larger than an individual. It was about systems, ethics, and the human spirit's capacity to endure invisibility and manipulation. It was about presence within absence, identity persisting in silence, and resistance carried through decades without recognition. Berlin carried that tension in its rhythm. Streets, trains, offices, and schools were infused with quiet lessons of responsibility and vigilance. Citizens, scholars, and officials alike were forced to ask themselves, how much of the past can we tolerate? How much injustice can we permit? And how do we measure what survives in absence? And so, even after more than a decade, the Richter case continued to breathe. Not in headlines, not in verdicts, not in confessions, but in presence. Persistent, unyielding, morally urgent. It had become a standard for how societies reckon with history, how they honor identity under threat, and how they confront silence as a tool of control. The cold case had never truly closed. It had only begun its permanent work, shaping conscience, memory, and the moral heartbeat of a city that could never again ignore what had endured. Decades had passed, and Berlin had changed almost beyond recognition. Skyscrapers reached higher, streets widened, Neon and glass replaced brick and mortar. But the shadow of the Richter case lingered, subtle yet unrelenting, like a pulse beneath the city's rhythm. The story of Anya Richter, once a cold case confined to files and fading memories, had become a moral legend, a template for vigilance and conscience, a reminder that absence is never simple and presence is never entirely gone. It began with the discovery in the digital archives, a series of encrypted files uploaded by anonymous sources long after the events they chronicled, containing fragments of recordings, surveillance logs, and messages never seen before. Analysts working with AI-assisted pattern recognition began to reconstruct movements, behaviors, and interactions that had been obscured for decades. The data suggested that Richter had been far more active, far more deliberate in her resistance than anyone had imagined. She had maneuvered within the system, leaving invisible traces, guiding outcomes subtly, asserting presence where official channels sought to erase her entirely. The public was fascinated. Virtual exhibitions allowed citizens to explore Berlin as Richter might have seen it. Streets, offices, corridors, and border checkpoints recreated in painstaking detail. Users could follow her steps, reconstruct her path, and feel the tension of her existence under surveillance. It was immersive, disorienting, and deeply affecting. A city seen through the eyes of someone who had been denied acknowledgement yet refused erasure. Historians and ethicists debated the implications. Richter's survival was no longer just a moral story. It became a case study in agency, resilience, and the ethical limits of bureaucracy. Universities offered courses exploring administrative disappearance, long-term monitoring, and identity persistence, citing Richter as the ultimate example. Her case had moved beyond law enforcement and memory. It had entered philosophy, political science, and digital ethics. Unexpectedly, whistleblowers came forward. Former intelligence officers, some now in their 80s, provided confessions that had been impossible to secure before. They described Richter not as a passive subject but as an adversary in a silent intellectual struggle. Anticipating moves, manipulating perception, exploiting gaps in surveillance, surviving by understanding the machinery that sought to erase her. Their accounts painted a picture of extraordinary resilience, of a human being asserting autonomy in the face of methodical invisibility. The city itself responded. Berliners erected unofficial monuments along streets, transit lines, and former wall sites. Abstract installations, digital plaques, augmented reality markers. Each represented presence within absence, persistence against erasure. Schools, museums, and public institutions used her story to teach vigilance, moral courage, and the subtle dangers of bureaucratic indifference. She had become not only a symbol of endurance but a guide for ethical consciousness, a living echo that refused to fade even decades later. Yet even with all this attention, her ultimate fate remained unknown. Was she still alive, living quietly somewhere, or had she passed decades ago, leaving only traces and influence behind? That ambiguity became central to the legend. Richter existed as both person and idea, a moral constant, a touchstone for questioning power, ethics, and the human capacity to endure systematic invisibility. Technological advances complicated the story further. AI reconstructions suggested movements across cities, subtle hints of interaction with others who had disappeared, and untraceable patterns of communication. Each simulation created more questions than answers. Had Richter continued to intervene in small ways, shaping outcomes invisibly, guiding the city's moral compass from behind the scenes? Or were these patterns simply artifacts of imperfect data, echoes of her persistence amplified by technology? The cold case, now more than 60 years old, had transformed entirely. It was no longer about law enforcement or resolution. It was about legacy, about the endurance of identity under pressure, and the subtle moral forces that outlast human memory. Berlin had absorbed her story into its very being, and the city, in turn, had changed in response. More reflective, more conscious, more aware of how easily absence could be weaponized and how endurance could be revolutionary. Even the youngest generation, born long after the wall fell, engaged with the case. Digital scavenger hunts, VR simulations, and interactive histories allowed them to experience the tension and resilience that Richter embodied. She was no longer just a historical figure. She had become an ethical touchstone, a narrative force reminding every citizen that vigilance, memory, and recognition are vital to preventing the repetition of past injustices. And so, the Richter case persisted, not in headlines, not in verdicts, not in cold files, but in awareness itself. The city carried her story as a continuous pulse. Moral, ethical, indelible. Systems can erase documents, silence witnesses, even obscure a life, but they cannot erase presence when identity endures with vigilance, strategy, and resilience. Richter had transcended disappearance. She had become an enduring force, a ghost of conscience walking alongside every citizen of Berlin, reminding them that some cold cases never truly close. They evolve, persist, and shape the very future they touch. Even decades on, Berlin listened. Even decades on, it remembered. Even decades on, the cold case remained open. Not for law, not for closure, but for conscience. Decades turned into a century, yet the Richter case refused to be relegated to history. Berlin itself had become a living archive, where the story of Anja Richter persisted not in files, nor in headlines, nor in the fading memory of witnesses, but in the very rhythm of the city. Children learned of her as part of civic education, citizens referenced her as a moral compass, and scholars debated her enduring influence on ethics, identity, and governance. The cold case had become a blueprint for conscience. New discoveries surfaced unexpectedly. During renovations of a long-abandoned intelligence archive, workers uncovered a sealed vault, untouched for decades. Inside were hundreds of documents, photographs, and personal effects, meticulously labeled and cataloged, but never filed. There were maps showing movement patterns, cryptic codes never decrypted, and journals, Richter's journals, filled with precise observations, reflections on control, resistance, and survival. Her writing revealed not fear, but strategy. She had been aware, always calculating, always surviving within systems that sought to erase her. Technologists scanned the documents, reconstructed the codes, and for the first time, hints emerged of communications Richter had initiated herself. Messages hidden in plain sight, directives left to influence events, guidance to others trapped within bureaucratic systems. She had never been passive. Her persistence was not simply a reaction to control. It was an ongoing form of quiet resistance, an intellectual and moral defiance that left traces for future generations to uncover. The revelations sparked a wave of public reflection. Berliners realized that the machinery which had once attempted her erasure could not destroy vigilance, creativity, or morality. Citizens, historians, and ethicists debated the significance. Was her survival physical, moral, or both? Could someone exist entirely within societal blind spots yet leave a forceful mark on ethics and conscience? The Richter case had evolved into an abstract, almost mythic principle. Presence could never be fully extinguished. Even the architecture of the city carried her influence. Public installations, some digital, some sculptural, marked the spaces she had passed through, always subtly, always emphasizing endurance rather than victimhood. VR simulations allowed people to inhabit her perspective, experiencing the tension of life under surveillance, the persistence required to navigate control systems, and the courage embedded in mere awareness. Berlin had transformed these lessons into lived memory, a constant reminder that absence, once weaponized, cannot defeat identity. Unexpectedly, new evidence hinted at a broader pattern. Other individuals across Europe during the same era had experienced similar orchestrated disappearances and systematic monitoring. Richter's story became a lens through which historians reevaluated an entire generation of cold cases. She had been emblematic, not singular. Her persistence, documented in journals and photographs, was now seen as both personal triumph and collective revelation. The moral force of her case extended far beyond Berlin, influencing discussions of human rights, ethics, and state power globally. Yet even with these discoveries, the question of her ultimate fate, alive or dead, remained unresolved. In the end, it no longer mattered. The Richter case had transcended physical resolution. It had become a living narrative, a benchmark for vigilance, a moral standard embedded in law, education, technology, and culture. Presence persisted beyond absence, influence survived beyond identity, and conscience endured beyond suppression. As the city moved into a new century, with generations unaware of the wall, yet profoundly shaped by its shadow, the Richter case continued to pulse beneath daily life. It reminded Berliners and the world that absence can be weaponized, but identity, vigilance, and resistance leave marks that cannot be erased. Cold cases may close, but moral presence never fades. Anya Richter had become immortal not through survival but through endurance, through ethical force, through the impossible persistence of self. And in the quietest moments, when the wind rustled along the former wall lines, when archives hummed with digitized data, and when students traced her path through history lessons, the city seemed to whisper a single, unbroken truth. Some absences are louder than presence, some cold cases never end, and some lives echo forever.